Welcome to Foxtails Folklore, where we explore new stories and tell old tales. We are building a community through the ancient art of storytelling. We share our stories, and we hope to inspire you to stand up, sing out, to find your voice. Our stories shape our world. Your story can change the world. Join the chorus and fall in love with the world again and all of its possibilities. Everybody who has seen one loves hummingbirds. And if you haven't seen one, go outside, look for them, put up some feeders, attract them to your neighborhood. Hummingbirds, without a doubt, are one of the most phenomenal birds in the world. And this episode is dedicated to hummingbirds. We're going to start with one of my favorite stories about how the ruby-throated hummingbird got that beautiful ruby throat. This is a traditional porqué, or why and how story. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, gua, hey, gua, hey, gua, hey, gua, hey, gua, hey, gua, gua. In the beginning, when the world was new, there were some things left undone. In those long ago days, the hummingbird was a rather plain, kind of drab bird, mousy gray-brown. But one day, as the hummingbird was perched in a little tree, it saw something pretty amazing coming by. There was a huge buck, one of the largest deer it had ever seen, and the deer was running rather quickly. And there was fear in its eyes, and as the deer was racing down the trail, the hummingbird saw why. A panther, a cougar, was racing along behind it. The deer ran as fast as it could, leaping over logs, ducking under branches, and the panther was hot on its tail. But as the hummingbird was watching the deer flee and the panther chase, one thing the panther did not see, because the panther was so focused on its prey, that huge paw, splat, flattened a little mouse's nest. Inside, the babies were blind and furless, pink. The mother, she was infuriated. The little mother mouse came out and said, "Hey, who are you stomping on my nest? Who do you think you are? Watch where you're going. I'm going to teach you a lesson." Now, can you imagine this? A huge buck racing down the trail, followed by a panther, followed by a little mouse cursing at the panther. Well, eventually the deer bounded away. Typically, a large cat is lucky if 1 out of 7 hunts is successful. The cougar was tired, so the cougar wandered on down by the river, and because they generally hunt at night, in the heat of the day they sleep. And as the cougar curled up to go to sleep, because it had stopped, the little mouse caught up. Well, the hummingbird thought this was so peculiar, so intriguing, that the hummingbird followed along. And as the hummingbird buzzed along behind, it saw the mouse when it reached the cougar. The panther was asleep. The little mouse said, "I'll teach you. You better watch where you're going." And the little mouse went down to the shore of the stream, gathered up some of the soft mud, and very gently placed those little bits of mud over the eyes of the large cat. Little pat, little pat, little pat, little pat, little pats of mud, until soon it was a full mask. And because the panther was sleeping in the hot sun, that mud soon hardened and dried. "That'll teach you to watch where you're going. Now you won't see anything." And the little mouse turned and headed home, back to her nest to tend to her young. Oh, the little hummingbird thought this is going to be good. And the hummingbird perched in a tree to see how things turned out. Sure enough, a little while later, the panther woke up and it couldn't open its eyes. It couldn't see. And it started walking, boom, it ran into a tree. It almost fell off the cliff into the river. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" The little hummingbird came buzzing down, and the little hummingbird said, "Be still, I can help." And as the panther stood still, the hummingbird used its little beak to peck and pry and crack the little bits of mud until eventually the panther could see. "Oh, Hummingbird, thank you so much for what you have done." And the hummingbird then told the panther all that it had seen. "Oh, you saved my life," said the cougar. "You deserve something for your noble act." "I have an idea. You are so plain and gray." The cougar grabbed some leaves, some fresh green grass. And you know, cats sometimes will eat grass. It's good for their digestive system. Well, the cat chomp, 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 chewed up that grass and then took that lime emerald green saliva and smeared it over the back of the hummingbird. And from that day until this one, hummingbirds are emerald green. But then, even a little more special, by the shore of the river, there was some bright red clay mud. And it had a mineral called mica that is like glitter and reflective. And took a little bit of that mud and spread it on the chin, on the throat of what is now the ruby-throated hummingbird. And it does reflect sunlight when it's in the light just right. And the ruby-throated hummingbird, it still wears that emerald green back and that bright red throat to remind us of this story, to remind us that one good deed often deserves another. So this next story is from the Tsalagi, or the Cherokee, from my ancestors. And it's a story of how Hummingbird helped to place the stars. Hey, umgua, hey, umgua, hey, umgua, hey, umgua, hey, umgua, hey, umgua, umgua, umgua. In the beginning, when the world was new, there was no separation between day and night. It was actually daylight all the time. Now, many of the animals really loved it. They could eat and eat and eat and eat, and soon they began to consume everything. Now, some of the animals, they wanted a place to hide from their enemies, a place to hide in darkness where they would be safe. But because of this consumption, because things began to be diminished and eventually disappear, if that's all you do is eat and consume, Gitchimanatu, the maker of us all, wanted to put a stop to that. Gitchimanatu took a huge wet blanket and threw it out over the sky, and everything was dark. Everything was so pitch black, nobody could see where they were going. Boom! The bear ran into a tree. Ah! He fell off a cliff. Everybody just kind of stumbled apart, stumbled around. And so they called out, "Hey, over here, where are you?" And they gathered together in a council circle. Now, Native people believe, as I believe, and I hope you believe, that we all have a good mind when we use it. When we put our minds together, we come up with the best ideas. So everyone was listened to. Everyone was given that respect. Someone said, "We need to go up and see what that thing is that shut out all the light." And it was decided that Eagle should go, because Eagle could fly higher than any other bird. But just as Eagle was taking off, a little tiny hummingbird slipped in under the eagle's feathers. Now, you know a hummingbird weighs less than a nickel when it begins its fall migration. And at the end of that one long trip, it weighs less than a penny, losing half of its weight. Well, this tiny little hummingbird was so light that the eagle didn't even feel it. And Eagle flew higher and higher. In a large circle, Eagle flew higher and higher until Eagle ran into that big wet blanket. Eagle turned and with its huge sharp talons ripped a large hole. And this bright light came shining down. Today, we call it the moon. And all the animals down below, they could see, and they cheered and roared and barked their approval. But just as the eagle turned to go down, Hummingbird zipped out. And because Hummingbird is the only bird that can fly backwards and upside down, Hummingbird took that sharp little beak and began poking holes in the sky. Now at first, the animals on the ground below, they did not notice. They were so thrilled what Eagle had done for them. But as Eagle came flying down, they began to notice these tiny little lights appearing above them. More and more and more of them. And then they noticed that this pattern of little holes began to draw pictures, like a great eagle flying across the sky, or a huge bear, Ursus Major, and a smaller bear, Ursus Minor, the little bear. There were crabs and spiders. They were all manner of creatures. And the light grew brighter and brighter until they began to see it was Hummingbird, who placed all those little pinpoints of light that you call stars. And especially when the animals saw their pictures being made, they cheered and roared their approval. And still to this day, once a month, that bright moon guides us on those dark nights. But then that huge hole, it will slowly mend itself before another one opens. But those little pinpricks of light, they are there every night. So even on the darkest night, we can find our way. And that is how that story goes. Hey, 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 gua. Hey, 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 gua. Hey, hey, gua. Hey, hey, gua. Hey, gua. Hey, gua. Gua. In that long ago time, there was one, she was so hot. One look at her and you were thirsty. She was so kind, generous beyond measure. She, most important, was so wise. She was such a good listener. She could help anyone, and many wanted her help. Many wanted her hand in marriage. There were many suitors who sought her approval, but somehow none of them were quite good enough for her. Now her parents said, you know, you won't always be so beautiful. As you get older, it might be harder to find a mate, a partner. You should choose one now. She was reluctant. There were two who never gave up. Two who still pursued her. One was tall and lanky. Whoop, 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 the whooping crane, with a little red on top, a little black at the tip of its wings, pure white feathers. Now, when Whooping Crane was on the ground, sometimes he seemed a little awkward. But when Whooping Crane took flight, he could fly for hours, higher than any other bird. Actually, we now know that cranes are the highest flying bird on the planet. They will fly over the tallest mountains in the world. The other one was Hummingbird. Hummingbird with his wings moving in that figure eight, zipping here and there. She was reluctant to admit it, but with that bright ruby throat and that emerald green back, Hummingbird was nearly as handsome as she was. So she decided maybe she would let them decide through a race. They would have a great race to the distant mountains, Katua, and back once more. And so it was announced, and all the animals gathered. Now, some of them cheered for the crane. Most of them cheered for the hummingbird. The hummingbird was so fast, they thought for sure he was going to win. The journey to Katua, the sacred mountains, and back, it would take at least 7 days, a full week of flying. So on that morning, when the race began, the hummingbird zipped up, circled 3 times, zip, 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 and then zoom, raced off. Woohoo! Everyone cheered. Whereas the crane started running in the wrong direction. Everyone said, hey, the mountains are over here. But Crane awkwardly ran and caught the wind and began to soar. But Crane was looking for a place where the sun had already warmed the earth, and that warm air rising would give him lift. And with his long wings spread, he could circle higher and higher, letting the rising warm air carry him. And soon, when he was high enough, he turned and headed towards the mountain. And in this way, he could glide for hours without flapping. Now the hummingbird, zoom, zip, 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 raced on up ahead. Finally, near dark, the hummingbird stopped, fed, ate a few insects. They are mostly nectivores, eating mostly nectar from flowers, but they will occasionally eat insects, extra protein, extra energy. But as the hummingbird went to sleep, the crane kept soaring all day and into the night. Somewhere early the next morning, Whooping Crane actually passed the hummingbird and stopped by a small stream to preen his feathers, catch a few crawdads, maybe a snake, get a little food. Now, Hummingbird woke up, preened his feathers, zipped up, and took off and was amazed to see that Whooping Crane had passed him. Hummingbird redoubled his effort, flew as fast as he ever could. And you know, they can fly at incredible speeds. Crane took his time. After he had refreshed himself, he flew off looking for another thermal. Again, rose quite high, and then soared towards the mountains. The next day, when Hummingbird raced off, it was almost lunchtime before he passed the Whooping Crane. And the third day, it was after lunch. The fourth day, they circled the mountains and they headed back, and it was late afternoon before Hummingbird passed the crane. On the fifth day, it was early evening. On the sixth day, the Hummingbird did not see the crane. On the seventh day, the crane arrived early in the morning, stopped by a small pond on the edge of the village, took his time preening, making his feathers as beautiful as he could, and then proudly came strutting in to the council grounds. All the birds were amazed. Whooping Crane had won, but they waited to see when the Hummingbird might come back. The Hummingbird came late in the afternoon and basically plopped down. It was so beaten and bedraggled. It was decided. Whooping Crane had won. It was decided. Or was it? She went over and she whispered in the crane's ear. Now what she said, I do not know. If I knew, I would tell you. But let me tell you what I do know. Whooping Crane turned beet red. How many of you ever blushed when you were embarrassed? You know, that red patch on a crane's head, that's not feathers. That's actually skin. And just like you turn red when you are embarrassed, cranes do that. Oh, Crane was so beet red, but whatever she said, I do not know. She decided not to marry. That is a choice. She decided instead she would be wed to the entire village. She became a wise one, a medicine woman, a healer, a midwife who helped children come into this world and helped the elders cross over to the world beyond. All sought her counsel. And he, Whooping Crane, he settled for one of his own tribe, another Whooping Crane. And they lived happily together and raised many offspring. But even when he was an old man, and cranes are long-lived birds, sometimes he'd be sitting there and he'd think of that glorious day when he won the great race. And then he would think about what she said and he would blush once more. Obviously, I'm not the only one who loves hummingbirds. One of John James Audubon's most beautiful portraits is of the ruby-throated hummingbird on a trumpet flower. We'll let John James Audubon tell the story. Who has not seen this glorious fragment of a rainbow, a winged jewel, and your mind does not turn to the greatest of affection and appreciation? The hummingbird, without a doubt, is one of my favorite birds. Its little wings move in a figure 8 at 70 beats per second. They are flying backwards and upside down. I have a dear friend who captures hummingbirds on the Gulf Coast. She has caught the same bird in the same spot with the same net on the same day at more or less the same time 3 years in a row. What a hardy little bird. Now you do some math with me. Knowing their wings move at 60 to 70 beats per second. How many seconds in a minute? 60. How many minutes in an hour? 60. 60 times 60 times 60 wing beats per hour. And it takes them 10 to 18 hours to cross the Gulf of Mexico. When they begin that flight, they weigh less than a nickel. When they finish, they weigh less than a penny. They lose half of their body weight in that single flight. So what an amazing little bird. To think, my friend, catching the same bird 3 years in a row on its return journey, it has crossed the Gulf 6 times. Imagine you making such a flight, the adventures you would have if you're such a tiny bird. Imagine the stories that you could tell. Let's hear what Cindy has to say about banding hummingbirds.
Doug invited us last year to come band some of his hummingbirds because he has quite a few here. And so we banded just over 100 hummingbirds last year. And so we're back here this year to see if any of those birds have returned.
Today we had my granddaughter, Jillian Ratliff.
Nice and flat.
This is so sweet.
I got to spend today with Jillian, and she was most interested in the hummingbirds, and so we like to encourage young people to take an interest. Because if you love something, you'll work to protect it.
But she was very nervous about coming today because she had never held a hummingbird, and she wanted to make sure she was going to hold it correctly and gently and not hurt the hummingbird.
Then we're going to have him come out and say hello, and we're going to measure his bill, that part right there.
Oh, it's super sharp.
Yeah, it is. I love to show kids hummingbirds, and so she helped me today with my hummingbird banding. We're going to look inside.
I'll name him.
Okay, what do we want to name him?
Blue Jay.
Mr. Blue Jay, okay. Oh, she was very enthusiastic. Now what do? We measure. That's right.
Said it.
Told her one time what I was doing, and then she told me how to do it.
She's very precocious, so she's a quick learner. So she was helping in the banding process, and I noticed very quickly she was providing some instruction to the banders on how they should do it correctly.
Okay.
And can I blow his tummy?
Oh yeah, you can blow his tummy.
I'm going to blow his tummy with
Okay.
the pink one.
With the pink one? Okay. Now we're going to blow on him.
Now I too.
Okay, blow the feathers to see if you see any fat. Do you see any fat?
Yeah?
You do?
Yeah.
I don't see any fat.
Let me see.
Okay. Okay. She wanted to participate. She helped me blow on the birds and look for fat. She named each bird as they left us. And so now they not only have a number, but they have a name.
Pinky.
Pinky?
Yeah.
All right.
I named him Pocahontas, and I named him Mr. Blue Jay, and I also made them Moana.
For children, hummingbirds are mystical, magical.
Oop, he's going to go quick. Oop, there he goes.
She had the opportunity to hold one in her hand and to release the hummingbird back into the wild. And you could just see the intense excitement on her face. So it's a moment she'll remember the rest of her life. This is fun for everybody. Who wouldn't like to come and watch these professionals catch and band hummingbirds? Most people never see a hummingbird through the whole year in the wild. You know, here at Ruskin, we started feeding 20 years ago in a summer camp, and the bird population just kept growing and growing and growing because they'd come back each year. More and more little ones that would survive and come back and raise again. But the chance to capture a hummingbird and band it and determine the health of the bird provides a service, I think, to the ecology and taking care of the population of the birds. But it's just fascinating to watch that. Hummingbirds are a real miracle of nature.
Who has not seen this glorious fragment of a rainbow, a winged jewel, and your mind does not turn to the greatest of affection and appreciation? The hummingbird, without a doubt, is one of my favorite birds. Its little wings move in a figure 8 at 70 beats per second. They are flying backwards and upside down. I have a dear friend who captures hummingbirds on the Gulf Coast. She has caught the same bird in the same spot, with the same net, on the same day, at more or less the same time, 3 years in a row. What a hardy little bird. Now you do some math with me, knowing their wings move at 60 to 70 beats per second. How many seconds in a minute? 60. How many minutes in an hour? 60. 60 times 60 times 60 wing beats per hour. And it takes them 10 to 18 hours to cross the Gulf of Mexico. When they begin that flight, they weigh less than a nickel. When they finish, they weigh less than a penny. They lose half of their body weight in that single flight. So what an amazing little bird. To think, my friend, catching the same bird 3 years in a row on its return journey, it has crossed the Gulf 6 times. Imagine you making such a flight. The adventures you would have if you're such a tiny bird. Imagine the stories that you could tell. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Foxtails Folklore. Next time, invite your friends. And maybe you can send us a link to you telling one of your favorite folk tales, and we'll use it on an upcoming episode. Join our choir to fall in love with the world and all of its possibilities.